name is Miguel, host of Life on Circle Radio. You know, we normally have a lot of fun with this show. We always have fun with this show. We've been doing this show for a long time. But sometimes it's time to stop the jokes and try to learn a little bit and try to learn what's going on in the world. A little under 10 days ago, there was a horrific attack by Hamas on Israel. And what we know about here in America is that pro-Israel here in America, obviously we're anti-terrorism, which is what Hamas has inflicted upon the Israelis. But we also understand that there is a conversation that has to be had. This is going back 70 plus years. And so instead of trying to speculate about this type of stuff, we try to find people who know what they're talking about and we try to learn something. And so we found ourselves a group of folks that we're going to have on the show this evening who's going to give us some education, give us a little bit of perspective so that we can be better educated going forward when it comes down to this conversation. So let me bring in the super producer. What's up?
What's up? I'm sorry. This is such a huge show. We want to make sure that it's promoted properly. Yeah. This has been a scramble that we put together, but I'm super excited to get the show started and have this conversation outside of, before we have this huge conversation on the conflict, homeowners. If you are about to buy a home and you go to a home and you see a beautiful oak tree in the driveway or next to the driveway in the yard, and you're like, oh, this is so beautiful. It provides shade for the home. Don't buy that home. You know why? Because that oak tree is going to get bigger and it's going to either destroy your porch or, in our case, our driveway. We are now dealing with a nightmare of having roots that grew around water pipes, like water pipes that go into our house. We had to have the entire driveway lifted up, pipes replaced, and now the driveway relayed. It's a nightmare. So that's just my complaint for today. There's that.
Key is life, and so I am fighting. I've been fighting the flu bug all weekend. So if my voice sounds horrible, because I got my Barry White going on, it is because this flu bug. And so my wife just brought me some tea, and we're going.
Sips tea for real. And we will be sipping tea at the end of the show to talk about Jada Pinkett Smith. So serious first. And a little bit of fun towards the end. So let's go ahead and get the show started.
All right, so let's get into this thing. And I want you to go ahead and give our guest his proper and introduce him, our first guest that'll be on the show.
Our first guest is Dr. Noam Weissman. He is one of the VPs at Open Door. And it's a great organization that is helping, young Jewish people and Jewish people and younger Jewish people connect, get more information, educate. So we're super excited to have him on the show because he knows more about it than we do. So please welcome Dr. Noam Weissman.
Dr. Weissman, how are you, sir?
I'm so well during this incredibly awful time period. That's where we are. But I agree with you about the oak tree. That'll start with that.
That sucks. When she told me that story, last week or a couple weeks before, I think is this the homeowners association situation?
This is the homeowners association. They are the ones who they were like, we don't like how your driveway looks. It's ruining the aesthetics of the neighborhood. I was like, all right, who cares?
All right. As Mama Blanche says in the comments, rich people problems. So we got real stuff we need to be discussing. Yes,
that's my Dr. Weissman. That's my mother. That's my mom who just posted that. So there's that. Blanche. Okay.
All right, Dr. Weissman, we want to get into this conversation, and we certainly want to give you an opportunity to talk extensively about. There was a video, and we'll post it on our page after the show. They can get a little bit more in depth. But you had a wonderful video where you talked a lot about the situation. But let's talk a little bit about what happened 8 or 9 days ago and the response, and let's just open the door there.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I lead a media company that is focused on teaching the world, not just Jewish people, the world, about the history of Israel, the history of the Jewish people, the story of anti-Semitism, the story of Zionism, which we should probably get into, and make sure that we all understand what this history is. And it's very difficult to start answering the question about what happened 9 days ago without understanding the history. Because 9 days ago, what happened was Hamas exposed exactly who they are. Hamas is, in English, it stands for the Islamic Resistance Movement. And for many years, they pretended that they were simply part of the political echelon, that they were governing Gaza, just like the Palestine Liberation Organization, just like Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, that they're another political group to be reckoned with. And then they did their activities that were so gross that were so despicable, not only because of how many people that they killed, how many civilians that they targeted, how many babies, women, men, soldiers, civilians that they went to their houses and shot them, and then took and kidnapped hundreds of abductees. But Hamas recorded it all. That's
Yes.
the crazy thing. They recorded it all.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone very famous once said, when someone tells you who they are, believe them.
Yeah.
And Hamas's charter in the late 1980s exposes for the world, broadcasts for the world exactly who they are. And one of their leaders recently said, they said Hamas made Israelis think it was busy with governing Gaza. All the while, under the table, Hamas was preparing for this big attack. That was Ali Barakeh, who was a Hamas leader. And that is what's been going on. And then Israel had to respond.
Yeah. So, first of all, we're definitely grieving with your community. I think
Absolutely.
one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation is because we don't know enough. We just don't. I have my wife served in the American Army. She served in the Middle East, and we know there's different reasons why we get into these conflicts, right? We know Israel is very strategic, position-wise, in the Middle East. That America is aligned with Israel. When people look at this stuff, because there's a lot of folks that are saying that they're pro-Palestinian, and we're humanists. We're just like, God, we just want people to stop fighting, man, stop killing each other. That's that's what we would like to see. But when you see people who say, this has been going on for years, and Israel has been killing, the Palestinians for years. What is your response to that?
Has Israel been killing Palestinians? I think that's there's a massive distinction between targeting civilians and being in a position of war in which you are battling them. So let's go through the history. And I want to say one really important thing before we do this. There is no need to pretend like Israel's history is pristine and is perfect. There's no need, from my perspective, to tell everyone that Israel's the good guy and Palestinians are the bad guy. That is, to me, that's the stuff of fairy tales. That's the stuff of fantasies. And all of us should be much more matured, much more responsible, mature civilians and consumers of content and the world to really be thinking in that sort of way. So I could go through the history of Israel in which Israel has done things that are untoward or imperfect. And I have a podcast that I host for Open Door Media for Unpack called Unpacking Israeli History, which broadcasts and is willing to tell the stories of Israel's imperfections. It tells the stories of 1948 of Deir Yassin. It tells the stories of early 1950s Kibbutz. It tells the story of Kfar Qasim in the mid-1950s. It tells the story of Sabra and Shatila. I have no problem sharing the history of Israel's imperfections, bad moments, and moments that that are what would be called black eyes on Israeli history.
Right.
That's not a problem to be able to share that. Just like we wouldn't have a problem sharing American history's imperfections. Anyone that tries to teach American history and tries to say that it's all perfect, it's all pristine, there was no slavery, there was no racism, there is no racism. To me, that's a silly thing to say. On the other hand, to pretend that Israel's history is something that is problematic, and to pretend like Israel's history is something that is unsavory, to pretend like Israel's history doesn't have a trajectory of wonderful and incredibly important moments, is also to be equally dishonest. So what I see happening in the media is people like to say Israel is bad. They are occupying the Palestinians. And since Israel was founded, they've been just trying to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. Since Israel's been formed, they've just tried to have genocide. That's not the facts. Those are not reality as I see it, and as the vast majority of people understand who pay attention to the moments in the history. Let's go into the history.
Well, let me ask a really blatant question to help you with the history question. What is the relationship between the Palestinians and Israel and the Jewish people who live there? Like, what's that relationship?
Sure. So there's a lot of different relationships. There are a lot of different types of Arabs living in Israel and Palestinians living in Israel. So I use those two different words interchangeably, not because they're the same thing necessarily. And people have different identities, and we have to allow people to really decide what their identity is. So there are a couple million Arab citizens of Israel who some identify as Palestinian, some do not identify as Palestinian, but they're Arab citizens of Israel. They have full equal rights as anyone else. They're in the Supreme Court, politicians. In the previous government, they were literally in the coalition. They were literally Muslim Arab in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament, that were part of the governing body, even though they didn't necessarily, not all of them, agreed with the concept of Zionism and a Jewish state. But Israel, nevertheless, allows those same people to be in its government. Could you imagine a world in which Hamas would have Jewish people in their government saying, we disagree with your policies and we disagree with what you want to do, and expect them to come out alive? The equivalence is crazy. Then you have Gaza and you have the West Bank. Okay, so these two different areas. Gaza is where Palestinians have been living. It's in the southwestern portion of the Land of Israel area. Israel left that area in 2005. Okay, it left in 2005, and in Hebrew it's called the Hitnatkut, which means the disengagement, where Ariel Sharon, who was this war hero who did a lot of controversial things in the history of Israel, but was a strong guy, he removed Israel from Gaza, removed settlements called Gush Katif, 8,000 to 9,000 settlers, who lived there, and was willing to sacrifice all of that and all of the land that they built up since 1967, all of the communities, all of the environment, all of the beautiful romantic things that were created there. And he took them out in 2005. And in 2005 in Gaza, Hamas had the opportunity to create what some people called Hamastan, right? It's a place where Hamas is now building up infrastructure. And then Hamas surprised the world. Hamas had elections with Fatah, and they won. And America and Israel were not happy about that because Hamas defeated Fatah. And Hamas has a genocidal charter, uses anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are like hilarious if they weren't part of the charter. Like things that make me internally be like, are you crazy? And then like grown men, I was gonna say grown men and women, it's probably just men mostly, the grown men actually believing these things. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example, makes it into their charter. Now they revised their charter in 2017, but they just clearly expose exactly who they are. And since 2006, Hamas has not had elections. Okay, that's 17 years that they have not had elections. That's in southwestern portion of Israel. Now, go to the more eastern portion. That's the West Bank. That's divided up into three different areas: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area B and Area C, Area A and Area B, broadly speaking, are mostly, if not exclusively, governed by the Palestinian Authority. And Area C, which is home to a few 100,000 Jewish settlers. Some people don't like that term, but Jewish residents, Jewish people who are living in the West Bank, which in biblical terms is called Judea and Samaria. That's in Area C, but no Jewish people live in Area A or Area B.
Well, let me follow up with another question. So, and this could be, again, me and Miguel and other Black people who watch this show, we're seeing certain social media videos where you see Palestinian women who are going to go pray and they're being attacked by Israeli soldiers. Now, can you, to the best of your ability, explain the videos? Like, we're seeing something, but with all videos you see, this is the video. We don't know what that means, what's happening. Can you explain those videos a little better? Because I think that is what makes a lot of people have like a visceral reaction. Like, these women just want to go pray. Why are they being attacked? Like, what's actually happening in these videos?
So I'd have to see those videos in order to respond. But
well, have you heard the stories of the Palestinian women?
Let me describe it a little bit. They had their prayer mats in the middle of the road. They were praying and they were forcibly removed. Now, who knows where they was in the middle of the road. It was and shopping area, whatever. They had their prayer mats down. They were praying and they were forcibly removed. So just as if that helps out you with a little bit of perspective.
Right, but so I don't know what happened, but again, the way I try to think about these sorts of things, this is the way I try to think about it. Okay, armies aren't always going to do things that are great. Armies are governed by people who are 18, 19, 20 years old, and they're trying to keep rules, they're trying to keep curfew, they're trying to keep safety. I happen to know a lot of soldiers in the Israeli army, a lot of soldiers. I know that they have no interest whatsoever in telling people how to go about their prayers in the slightest. That's why a couple million Muslims in Israel are praying 5 times a day, and that's no problem. In these videos, did they provoke the soldiers? Were they in a certain place where they shouldn't have been at a certain time? Was there a curfew? It could be one of those 2, 3 things. I have no
Well,
idea.
you just said a key word. Were they in a place they shouldn't have been? Like, that's a weird. Again, we live in Florida. I don't know if you're familiar with the term of like a sundown town. Like we live in Florida, and I grew up in a sundown town where there's certain times where, as a Black person, you're not allowed to be here, and that's just what it is. No matter, and is it one of those situations where they're just not allowed to be there? It just seems like a weird term to use.
Well, I don't. One of the, I think, dangerous things is to compare any situation in Israel to any situation in America. They're 2 radically different situations.
That's fair.
And
Absolutely.
I think one of the mistakes that we do is we try to interpret history from one corner of the world and say, "Oh, I'm going to interpret it through my prism, the way I understand it." I'm not saying here that like you're a phenomenal person. I'm just saying I don't want us to be interpreting the world that way, because what's going on in the Middle East,
what you're saying is right. We totally get what you're saying, that we can't compare these situations. All I'm saying is, like, it just reminds me of that, and that could be completely wrong, but it just reminds me of that.
I mean, I understand why the concept of oppressor and oppressed in general is utilized as this heuristic, as this paradigm that all of us follow in order to say, well, if someone is strong, if someone is privileged, then that means that they are doing something wrong. And I think there are massive systemic problems in the United States of America, massive systemic problems historically, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And guess what? There are problems in Israel as well. I have no problem saying that. But that has nothing to do, and this is what's so important, that has nothing to do with a group of people who do not want the existence of the Jewish state. If that was the case, and if there was a group of people, if Palestinians were guided by leaders who said, we are committed to the Jewish people having their own Jewish state, which they already have, by the way, so no one needs the permission from others. But if they were to say, hey, listen, we agree that there should be a Jewish state, it's all good, and we're going to negotiate on the lands within the West Bank and Gaza to figure this out moving forward, no problem. That's a conversation that can and should be had. The government in Israel, as we just saw, the people of Israel were most divided they've ever been in the history of Israel right before this took place. Right before this took place, the people of Israel were so divided about the government. For 9 months, hundreds of thousands of people were rallying against the Israeli government. And you know who the people are that are most committed to opposing Israeli policy and things that Israel does that's not okay? You know what they're called? Israelis.
Let me.
They're willing to do that.
Let me ask this question. Differentiate for us between, because I've read quite a few things. One thing, there's a difference between Jewish folk and Zionist, is what I've read. What is the distinction from your perspective between, or is that just, help me with that? Because I've heard you say Zion and Zionist quite a few times.
Yeah. So I'm very big into rebranding Zionism. I think the word Zionist is a word that people have been shying away from. I think that that's a massive mistake. Zionism, if you were to ask, I went to USC, I got my doctorate there. And I remember, if I were to,
you got to tell us if that's South Carolina or Southern California.
It's Southern California.
It's California, Miguel. We both graduated from HBCUs, and that's over here. So
I'm just messing.
Yes, USC.
We got these Southern folks, these SEC folks. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
College admission scandal.
Right. Exactly. So I was doing my my doctorate in educational psychology at the time, and I remember when it was described that when I would describe myself as a Jewish person, no problem, be Jewish, all good. But when I describe myself as Zionist, people are like, "Whoa, what are you trying to say?" Right? And so I was like, no. What do you think Zionist is? What do you think the word Zionist means? Do you think Zionist means that doesn't believe in the sovereignty for the Palestinian people to have sovereignty? Is that what you think Zionist means? Do you think Zionist means the type of person that says, "Hey, I don't want other people to have the ability to exercise their rights and freedom"? No, Zionism means one and one only thing. One and one only thing. It means it's the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Who doesn't believe in the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, which, by the way, is the most successful liberation movement in the history of Western civilization? That for 1,800 years, the Jewish people, who have 3 times a day been praying to return to Israel. What does that mean? What does that mean to return to Israel? It means to return to Israel. That when I say every morning, every afternoon, every night, that my eyes are guided towards Zion, every single morning, afternoon, and night.
You need to translate that because we don't know what that, like, can you translate that?
I know, but I just translated it. That my eyes are guided to Zion every single day. That's what it says. That's in our prayers. It's the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And it's inspired other people to say, hey, listen, we could do this. We could be liberated as well. See, Judaism is both a religion and a people. Look at my shirt. Look at my shirt. Esther 4:14. Most important verse in the entire Bible, in my opinion. You know why? It's the ultimate expression of Zionism. How is that possible? Zionism only emerged in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So what does that mean? No, Zionism is an expression of the Jewish yearning to be free, to be liberated, to restore the dignity to the Jewish person, to be able to stand up as an exclamation point and not a question mark. So let me explain what that means. For a number of hundreds of years, maybe 2,000 years, the Jewish people were walking around the world. They were subject to the whims of leaders from other countries. If someone was good to them, great. If someone wasn't good to them, terrible. And that's the way the Jewish person lived. They were pogroms. They were oppressed. They were persecuted. There were genocides. That's what the Jewish experience was. Now, there were also good experiences living in the exile, living in the diaspora. But a lot of Jewish history and culture emerged, without a doubt. But you know what? The Jewish person was hunched over, was unsure of him or herself, and had very little dignity. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Jewish people said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to be Esther 4:14 Jews. And that says, when Mordecai says to Esther, who was the queen of Persia, says, who knows, if not for now, this is your time to make things happen. This is your time. This is why you're in that moment. And what that means is for
we're gonna bring Brandon Woods in here in a second because he's in the queue. We want to bring him into the conversation.
Okay.
Well, I have a quick question. That's a really important question. And now that you explained what Zionist means, because we didn't know that's what that meant. How in the world, on God's green earth, did it get co-opted, and that term Zionist get co-opted into this completely different, I'm proud. It's different. It's said different than the way you explained it. And it's treated different than the way you just explained it. How did that happen?
In some communities, but not all communities. And so what happened was there was a whole movement guided by the Soviets. Everything started from the Soviets. And again, I'm going to plug this just because the whole history is there. You got to listen to Unpacking Israeli History, the history of Soviet Jewry. You got to watch Unpacked on YouTube and see these full videos on each of these topics. But the Soviet movement wanted to get rid of this concept of Zionism. And they started funding the Palestinians to make sure that they could help ensure that this Zionism thing would be branded terribly. And then in the mid-70s, there was a conference in the United Nations that said Zionism is racism. And so when that happened, that started leading to, and that was repealed in the early 90s, that this notion that Zionism is racism, but the idea got in people's heads. And the first time in the history of mankind in which Black people were taken to freedom as opposed to removed from Africa in shackles was in the early 1990s. The first time. And where was it? From Ethiopia to Israel. The first time in the history of mankind that they were taken because they were liberated, not because they were in handcuffs or anything like that. And so the Jewish people have proved time and time again that first of all, not a race at all, and B, not merely a religion. The Jewish people are a people that is comprised of different races, and it's comprised of religion. That is what it means to be a Jewish person.
That's interesting, and that's something that has been a question in my mind about the difference between being a Jewish or faith, and so that's a great perspective. I want to bring in Brandon Woods. Brandon Woods has an experience on the military side, U.S. military side, and I wanted to get his perspective. Brandon, you there, my man? Oh, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you, darling.
Let's see. You might have yourself muted.
And Noam, are you, Dr. Weissman, excuse me, are you good for a few more minutes?
Yeah, and please call me Noam.
Okay, sorry, it's a title habit. Like,
Yeah.
I'm a 38-year-old woman who, if a woman is only like 3 years old, I'm like, oh, hi, Mrs. So-and-so. And I'm like, I went to school with you. Why are you calling me that?
Brandon, do me a favor, go out and come back in, and we're going to figure out, see if we can see why you're muted, because I can't unmute you for some reason. So while we're doing that, we have...
Coming at me. Come at me, though. I want some good stuff. Give me the juice.
We have a
Give me the juice.
Here's some good stuff for you. And
I don't like this question.
You don't like it? He wants it. I'm gonna give it to him. And this is
Go.
This is my daughter. Okay. And so if Palestine was under British rule in the 1920s and Britain had then decided to award Zionists the Palestine land, can you explain why the Israelis feel the land? So you kind of answered that before.
No, I didn't.
Okay, well,
I got to answer Ronnie.
You did.
Are you kidding me? I didn't answer that question at all. And that's a phenomenal question. Because I wasn't asked it, but I'm happy to answer it.
Okay.
Perfect.
Because it's a good question from Ronnie. So
Awesome.
I love that question. So let's learn the history, okay? Because the history is complicated. Anyone that says that the history is not complicated hasn't read these books back here, okay? So it is complicated. Okay. Wait, but we got Brandon. So do you want...
No, answer. We'll bring you answer. We'll bring Brandon in.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But you have to let me answer the question. I got to get through the answer, okay? Because it's not one.
You're good.
It's not. I'm saying it's not 1 second. So for a very long time, here's the Jewish history. The Jewish people had a Jewish state in this area, Judea, until they were kicked out by the Roman occupiers in the 1st century of the Common Era. They were kicked out. They were removed. And for years always wanted to return, yearning back to return. And there were all different examples of that. Yehuda Halevi in the medieval time periods tried to guide people to go back. Ramban, a great religious leader, Nachmanides, tried to guide people back. Always different examples of the Jewish people returning and trying to return. The Ottoman Empire was established 16th, 17th century, and they oversaw a big region, okay? One of those regions was known as Palestine. The reason it was known as Palestine is because when the Romans exiled the Jews, they renamed it Palestine. And when the Arabs conquered that whole region in the 7th century, and the Muslims, they conquered it, they co-opted the name and utilized the name Palestine. Okay? In the fast forward again to the 19th century, while all of this is going on, there's still no state. There's no country called Palestine. There's a region called Palestine. Absolutely. In this region of Palestine, there were some Jewish people, some Christian people, but broadly speaking, there were Muslims and Muslim Arabs that lived there, okay? Mostly. In the early 20th century, no states, no countries. That's not the way it was. Didn't exist. 1917, Balfour Declaration comes and says, we declare that this is going to be the Jewish national home. Again, listen to the podcast, listen to the video. It's there. It explains the history. A few years later, ratified by the international community in what's called the San Remo Conference, that this would be a Jewish state and an Arab state, that this would be the case. And you can check all of this as I'm saying this. 1937, there was something called the Peel Commission, which after the Arab Revolt of 1936, the Peel Commission said, we want to create part of the land being Jewish and part of the land being Arab. The Arabs flatly rejected that. The Jewish people reluctantly agreed. Didn't happen. Fast forward 10 years later, 1947, the United Nations declared 33 countries to 13 to 10 that there should be a Jewish state and an Arab state. And again, the Arabs said, no, we want the entire thing. You do not have a claim to this land. So that happened again. And then the craziest thing in world history, not the craziest, I'm exaggerating. A big thing in world history, 1967, after Israel tripled in size, said, we're ready to negotiate. And the Arabs said, no, we're going to have the Khartoum resolution. No peace, no negotiations, and no recognition. And that sort of intransigence has made it very difficult. Now, I want to also be empathic to the Palestinian plight. And the Palestinian plight is really important to me for two reasons. Number one is I believe it would be an incredibly important thing for there to be a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, if that's possible. I deeply believe that would be great. If there were Jewish people living under Palestinian governance and Palestinian people living under Israeli governments, great. But when you get exposed the way Hamas just exposed themselves, how crazy would it be to want to allow for such a world? And that's what just happened right now. Hamas fully exposed themselves.
Not on the side of Israel. Truth is not on the side of the Palestinians. Truth includes a lot of what the Israelis and the Palestinians have to say. The true story is bigger than the narrow narratives that are being presented on social media and in the real media. And I think, like Dr. Noam presented a history. I agree with a lot of the history. A lot of the facts that he presented, I think, are true facts and really happened. Some of them a little less, but I know that is like the generic pro-Israel narrative that most Israelis believe. But I know there's also another story that needs to be incorporated into this. That's a radically different story than the story most Israelis are growing up believing. And I think that the real core, the fundamental obstacle to us being able to move forward here is that both Israelis and Palestinians are deeply threatened by the story of the other. And I think both sides have this tendency to reject the identity and the story and the national narrative of the other because they feel it'll undermine our own. And if only we'd be able to do that, if only we'd be able to courageously look at the story of the other and what it is, I think we'd be able to move forward together and create something really special in this land.
Well, I want to give Dr. Weissman an opportunity to respond, or if was there anything in particular that you disagree with that he presented earlier, so he would know how to address.
Yeah, I mean, Yehuda, I think, does a lot of great work in the West Bank, and I don't have much. I mean, the only thing I'd respond to what Yehuda said is the generic description of the history of Israel is not something I've ever been accused of doing. If you ever listen to how we make sure to teach the history of, like I mentioned, those moments of Der Yassin, of Sabin Shatila, Kfar Qasim, Kibbeh, if you look at the early 20th century and understand the different promises that were made by the British government to both the Arabs living there and the Jewish people living there, that's a reality that both peoples struggle with dealing with. And it's very much so the case that Israelis and Palestinians both struggle to see the humanity in the other and accept aspects of the narrative of the other. So what tends to happen as a result of all of this is it creates a zero-sum game where I try to express why my truth is the full and total truth, and the other person tries to express what they're trying to say as a full and total truth. And if I give up an inch of that, it feels like I'm giving up not just a yard, but a full football field, to use an American term. And so that becomes incredibly difficult. And when we learn the histories, and I want to add one more point at the end here. When we get to the histories, that we have to teach the histories of understanding the different narratives that are interwoven throughout, the Rashomon effect that is very real when we learn the history. And we have to be able to identify things as they are when they're not complicated. There are certain things that are incredibly complicated, and then there are certain things that are not complicated. And I think it's a big mistake to complicate simple things, and it's a big mistake to simplify complicated things.
Brandon, I want to bring you into this conversation real quick. And Brandon, tell us a little bit about your experiences in the American military, and your perspective on what we've been talking about. And thank you for your patience. I'm sorry we had all those issues with the audio earlier.
Yeah, sorry about the technical difficulties. Good evening, everyone. And I've just been enjoying and listening to the conversation. So I've got a bit of a foreign policy background, more so from an American perspective, but also have studied the Middle East, have worked in government here in the U.S., and also served as an Army officer, as an Army intelligence officer, and spent a year in Iraq. So that's kind of my overall background and perspective. And obviously, The events that we've seen in recent days are very traumatic, and also, to your point, complicated. There's a level of complexity. And I think as Israel determines what its military response is going to be, I think there needs to be some consideration of sort of what comes next, right? We think about the war in Iraq. Essentially, there was no plan for phase 4 operations. The initial part was planned, but what came after wasn't, and things can always get worse. So that's something that's been sort of top of mind for me.
Yeah, it's as I mentioned in the first segment of this show, and coming back into the segment of the show, I am of the people on this screen, I'm the most disconnected, but I'll represent our audience as trying to learn, because this is just a state of the world that we know that is scary for the rest of the world, and understanding that we just came out of 20 years in Afghanistan. We had the Iraq war almost 30 years ago, and we know that it's all about shifting power, but also using people's hearts to shift the power, right? Because there's a bit of religion in this, right? So there is Islam, there is Judaism, there's Christianity also that's also playing a part in this as well. Growing up as a Christian and growing up in faith-driven ministries, it was always we support Israel, and that's absolutely fine. But I look at it and I look at a map, and I say, where are the Palestinians supposed to go? They can't go south in Egypt because Egypt says, "Nah, we don't want you coming this way." Obviously, they can't go east. And I'm opening this up to the floor. What is the long-term goal? And is the two-state solution, is it a reality?
No.
Kind of give us some perspective with that.
It's dead. The two-state solution is dead, and it was always a problematic policy. It was something that was being forced on us by the United States and Europe. It's been consistent Western policy to push a two-state agenda on our country. It's not good for us. It's not good for the Palestinians. And again, it's just like the British and French in the post-World War I era, just dividing up, drawing lines on a map and thinking, okay, this will be yours, this will be yours. If they were to implement a two-state solution tomorrow, we would not be done fighting. And we'd be fighting for decades into the future. The only way for us to be able to end this conflict is to be able to learn to live together in one single state.
No.
What's my answer to the question?
Yeah, I didn't know if you had anything, if you had a response to that or not.
Well, I'd push Yehuda a little bit more to understand what does it mean for Palestinians and Jewish people to all be living within one state. I'd want to hear a little bit more about how to do that. And I think I don't know if this is getting in the weeds, but there's something called the demographic concern, which is if you have one state from the river to the sea, including Gaza and the West Bank, that to me sounds like a heck of a lot of educational work that's going to need to take place in order to ensure that that both peoples are going to have enough empathy for each other's histories and choose to believe that, Yehuda, that you are part of the Jewish people, not just the Jewish faith, and that on the other hand, that the people living in Israel will start, the Jewish people living in Israel will start to fully acknowledge that the Palestinians are a people and not just part of the Arab world. And so that's a whole educational challenge, but there's a demographic challenge of it. How does it maintain its status as a Jewish state, which I know you've spoken about many times in the past, while having 50% of the people not being Jewish? So I think that would be my challenge to Yehuda, and I'd love to know the answers to that solution, to that question.
Sure. Thank you for that setup. Basically, I would argue that right now, no solution can work. Not a one-state solution, not a two-state solution, not Professor Kedar's 8-state solution, not the status quo. Nothing can work because the relationships between Jews and Palestinians are problematic. I have a Palestinian colleague in Bethlehem, Sami Awad, who likes to say that everybody talks about solutions. It's like talking about a picture frame, but nobody addresses the actual picture in the frame. And if we can fix the picture in the frame instead of arguing over frames, then we're likely to find that a whole lot more solutions can be possible. for me, the only way to really move forward together is to change the roles we play in each other's stories, to change the roles we play in each other's narratives. Whether we have a wall between us or we don't have a wall between us, the wall is not going. We saw last week the wall is not going to protect us from one another. Ultimately, we need to actually create a situation where we're no longer the antagonists, we're no longer the monsters in each other's stories. And that's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of trust building. I believe that because the power dynamics favor Israel so much right now, Israel is responsible to make the first moves towards power, towards building trust. Now, I want to point out something else. One of the ways I think anti-Semitism works systemically is that Jews often experience ourselves as more vulnerable than we actually are, and outsiders see the Jews as more powerful than we actually are. So whenever conflicts flare up, we experience ourselves as punching up, and everyone else sees us as punching down. In many cases, whether it's an actual violent conflict or, it was a situation that flared up with Whoopi Goldberg or Kanye West. Like, we perceive ourselves as vulnerable and weak and needing to punch up against those who are attacking us, and others see us as using our power to silence those or just oppress or suppress those who are challenging us. And I think that one of the things that needs to be recognized is that the people of Israel, especially Ashkenazim, came back to our land with a lot of trauma. We have centuries and centuries and centuries of traumatic persecution that we haven't worked through, and we haven't gone through a process of healing that would allow us to have a normal relationship with the Palestinians. And of course, Palestinians have contributed to this as well. I don't want to pretend that they're innocent victims and all this. But in terms of what a state could look like, I think when we really examine the narratives on both sides, and when I say narratives, I mean, when I say a narrative, I really mean a collection of facts that are selectively chosen, organized and contextualized within an ideological worldview in order to tell a story. And I think that when it comes to our conflict with the Palestinians, our 103 years of conflict with Palestinians, we have millions of facts, and both sides really choose the facts that tell the story we want to tell, and we tend to both ignore the facts that complicate the story we're trying to tell. And I think we need to really understand the grievances and aspirations of both sides here. What's fundamentally important to the Jewish people, and has been for thousands of years, a story we've been telling ourselves generation after generation after generation, is we are going to come back to our land and we're going to have sovereignty in our land, just like we did before the Romans destroyed our civilization. That's what we've been telling our kids for 2,000 years, and that's what we managed to do in 1948 and 1967. In my experience, I've been working with Palestinians since 2009. My experience is that what's fundamentally important to Palestinians is that they have equality in a single state between the river and the sea, and that the refugee issue is addressed. I think the idea of a nation state is something that is perceived to be a European social construct amongst many Palestinians, and that it's something that could be a means to an end. But the nation state, I think, is much less central, in my experience, to Palestinian aspirations. And again, there are no Palestinians on the show, so it feels a little bit funny, trying to speak for them. But in my experience, the idea of a nation state, a flag, a national anthem, are much less central, much less core to Palestinian aspirations than they have been to Jewish aspirations. So I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. The note, we did have a Palestinian we invited. It just didn't make the show. But real quick, I want to make sure that I honor everyone's time. And before, because I know Dr. Weissman, we had you on for a while. We appreciate you sticking around with us. Brandon, give us the perspective from an international intelligence. What does this mean in the balance of power and in the world, right? This conflict in Israel, what does this mean as far as for peace for the world?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and just to make a quick point to the previous discussion, I think the situation in Gaza has to be addressed and considered. We have not had a serious peace process in probably more than 20 years. I think there's an utter lack of hope in Gaza. And in the absence of sort of an idea that things will be better for Gazans in the future, that there's something that they can believe that, again, their future will be better than their past, I think we're going to have a challenge. Gaza is one of the poorest places on the planet. According to the UN, it has a per capita GDP of $1,000 US dollars a year, which puts it below the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it truly is, in many ways, essentially a ghetto with people with no hope. And I think for them, I think they have felt forgotten, and this was in part their way to get the world's attention, and they definitely have the world's attention now. But I think having a meaningful peace process with objectives that can be achievable, maybe short of a two-state solution, I think is important. And look, there's been pockets of success and progress since 1947 that have been achieved through diplomacy. Right, Israel's no longer facing open war from many of its neighbors, or facing a threat of invasion from countries like Egypt. So diplomacy has worked, and diplomacy, as we know, is best suited, or the purpose of diplomacy is to engage with your enemies, not with your friends. And so, Hamas as Noah mentioned, was elected at least once 17 years ago. It's recognized by Russia. It's recognized by Iran. It has not been labeled a terrorist organization by the United Nations. And so, I think that determining what can a peace process that will give people hope look like, I think, is important consideration. Geopolitically, look, I mean, Russia's at war with Ukraine. Iran is supporting Russia with drones and other military technology. We've seen the emergence of an axis between Russia, China, Iran, possibly India, that seek a multipolar world where the United States is not the dominant power. Those superpowers are probably watching this through the prism of some type of proxy war, right? That this will divert American resources away from Ukraine, which would be to Russia's benefit. It would complicate America's positioning in the region, which could be to Iran's benefit. It can help mobilize or make Iran's presence more indispensable to its proxy allies, or the so-called Shia axis of resistance. So mass mobilization forces in southern Iraq, Alawites in Syria, Hezbollah, that they will become more dependent on Iran, and that Iran has a real hand to play here. So I think that the geopolitical implications are significant. I think it's possible that Hezbollah may enter this conflict. There's already been shelling, and in the Golan Heights, Israel has bombed the airport in Syria and Damascus. I think the Arab street, people sitting in coffee shops in Cairo and Damascus and Riyadh, obviously are going to have a point of view on this. And I think that the leaders of those countries are paying attention to it. We saw an Arab Spring more than 20 years ago, where we saw regimes in multiple countries toppled, Egypt, Tunisia. We saw a civil war in Syria that started. And so I think the Arab countries are trying to determine where do they sit, and what do their domestic constituents also think about this conflict. And I put a
Brandon,
lot out there.
Before I go, I want to respond to that last comment, because I think that the geopolitical analysis was really important for everyone to hear, and also incredibly disturbing, because what you're basically suggesting is that what Hamas did as this not just blatant but explicit voyeuristic terrorist moment in which they butchered and abducted 1,300 people, that this is going to become their Tet offensive, their 1968 Vietnam moment, in which they are getting the world's attention when the world was moving towards this place in which the Arabs and Israelis were moving towards peace. We're moving towards peace between the Saudis and the Israelis and many other Arab countries. And the Palestinians, through Hamas, not the Palestinians that Yehuda is meeting with, but the Hamas leadership in Gaza is, according to what you're saying, is going to win the world's attention. That through the act of butchering 1,300 people and putting that live and allowing everyone to see it, well, they got our attention. They got everyone's attention. Regardless of what the United Nations decides is a terrorist organization, and regardless of what Iran decides is a terrorist organization, with due respect to Iran, I don't really care whether or not Iran thinks someone else is a terrorist. That sounds like a crazy question to even entertain. The United States and the European Union very much so have designated Hamas a terrorist organization. And regardless of what the Westerners, like the United States, the Americans, and the Europeans decide is a terrorist, all of us were able to witness what Hamas believed in since 1988, since Sheikh Ahmed Yassin created Hamas, since Hamas emerged out of Muslim Brotherhood, and made very clear to the world that regardless of what the words in their charters are from 1988 to 2017 and the revisions, they publicized exactly who they are. And that is something that the world has to deal with. And as a Jewish American, I want to say, because Yehuda has a very different experience. Yehuda lives in the West Bank. Yehuda is at the seat of where Jews feel the strongest of all in Israel. As a Jewish American, the way many of us feel after seeing that people are supporting what Hamas did and giving lip service to a degree to seeing what Hamas did, and even any sort of semblance of saying, well, we understand a little bit. There's a little liberation that needs to happen. You know what a lot of Jewish Americans are doing? They're saying, we don't feel safe here. And you know what I want to do? I want to take off my kippah. I want to take off my yarmulke. I want to go to the middle of Nebraska. I want to go to the middle of America. And I don't want people to know I'm going to change my last name. I'll go from Weissman to White. That'll be my last name. And that's what a lot of people want to do. That's not something the American people, the American government, and the world should be tolerating. That Jewish people across the world should feel unsafe in 2023. Pathetic.
Gentlemen, I really appreciate all of your time, and I was going to give you the last word, Dr. Weissman. You took it, so that's good. I wanted to close out with you. This conversation has been an amazing conversation. We'll get it put back up and edit it. Okay, Kia, I can't bring you on camera, but your mic is open. Go ahead.
Oh, my mic is open. Thank God. Okay, so I have a really quick, important question. How do all three of you, each three of you can give your opinion, feel about the celebrity aspect coming and giving support? Because I have been very upset with a lot of celebrities who don't know about what's going on, have no education about it, who are making comments and posts that reach millions of people. Deborah Messing, and a lot of their opinions have been so one-sided or wrong or biased. How do you guys feel about that? I want to start with Uda. Now I know that you're pronouncing your name. How do you feel about that?
I don't know if I have strong feelings about what this or that celebrity are saying. I honestly don't take them all that seriously. I know there are a lot of people out there who do. I'm sorry. President company included. But it really, like, I mean, I saw the other day on Instagram, Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, posted something pro-Israel, and everybody started hating on him. It's tough. It's a landmine, and most people are coming from the outside, don't really understand what's going on. It's a complicated history. It's a complicated situation. Honestly, what I would prefer to see is for every celebrity to get up and say, you know what? The British and the United States has made a mess of the Middle East, and I think that everybody needs to butt out and let the natives of the region work it out together without Western interference. That's what I'd like to see.
Dr. Weissman? Dr. Weissman, how do you feel?
I have like this instinctive distinction that I'm going to end with somewhat of maybe an intellectual thought that's not mine. It's from a thinker named Micha Goodman, who explains that Israel struggles with, on the one hand, needing to feel feared and also needing to feel loved. And when Bono at part of U2 is like singing, we support Israel, Israelis love that. Part of one of the goals of Zionism, one of the many goals of Zionism, was to feel normal like anyone else. And being normal like anyone else is being accepted by everyone else. And there's a desire to be loved. But there's also a desire locally to be feared and to make sure that people will not take advantage of the Jewish people, because the result of when they are taken advantage of, terrible things happen. And so Israel struggles with, on the one hand, needing to feel loved by the world and also being feared locally. And that's a difficult dialectic to deal with. And me personally, I don't really care.
Yeah.
Mr. Woods, how do you feel about it? With celebrities chiming in about this conflict?
Yeah, so I mean, I think celebrities can play a role in drawing attention to things, drawing attention to the human suffering that's occurring, in this conflict, which is terrible. And I think celebrities can hopefully focus people on the need for peace and diplomacy and trying to find a future, a more secure future for Israel, a more secure future for Palestinians as well. And I think that we need a meaningful peace process, once again, because I think a meaningful peace process gives people hope and gives people something that they can believe in, that the future will be better without violence.
Well, I think that these type of conversations need to be more the norm and not because we don't see these type of conversations very often. We need to have a better understanding on what is going on, and I appreciate you gentlemen for coming on and helping us with this today. And Dr.
Absolutely.
Weissman, we're gonna you mentioned some content that you have. It is on your company's YouTube page.
Yes, we have. Yep, we got all his content.
All right, good deal. So
Unpacking Israeli history.
Yep.
Okay.
Everyone's got to learn the history. We all got to learn. We got to do the work. We got to do the work.
Brandon, Dr. Weissman. Man, excuse me.
Say it right.
I'm sorry.
Say it right. Say it right.
Put me out there. Yehuda. Is that pronounced correctly?
Yeah, actually it is.
All right. Well, see, thank you, Kia. You just give a brother a break. I'm sitting here fighting flu symptoms up here. We had it going. But first of all, I'm praying for your peace and your safety over there in Israel. I know that it is not something you're in the middle of this. And so we're sitting over here in the U.S. and we're just looking at it. But we're praying for your safety. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you so much for your time. And we'll have you on again soon if you'll come hang on with us again.
That was amazing. And I'm not going to cry. I'm a crier, mostly from stress. But that was everything that I wanted it to be.
Yeah.
It was everything I wanted to be. Thank you to all of our guests who came on the show. Thank you for understanding and listening to us, whether we're pronouncing your name wrong, the ignorance, it doesn't matter. We asked real questions that people want to know. We didn't get into the relationship between African Americans or Black Americans and the Jewish community, which is like another arm. That's a whole other hour show.
That's where I wanted to go, but I we had Dr. Weissman in for so long, but I know he would be engaged in that conversation, I'm sure. But I did want to go there, and we'll see if we can do a second part of this too. So I'm about to get
Great
up out
show.
of here, so I gotta say goodnight to my babies. But amazing show.
And you're sick, so go to sleep.
Yeah. I'm gonna sit up here and fix this up so we can have a nice, clean show that people can tune in at their leisure. But we appreciate y'all. I'm sure once I go out there and look at it, it's gonna be all these views and be like, oh God, do I have to kill this for real? We'll see. All right, we appreciate you. Thanks so much as always, the super producer, for doing such an amazing job pulling this together. We'll talk to y'all next week.